It's great to be here. Thank you for seeking me out for this talk. Maybe given your deep and rich knowledge of the church, you can sniff out a church geek even from this distance, or just by reading between the lines. To be clear, I am not a church historian. I write popular history as a journalist writing for general audiences, trying to hook their eyeballs long enough to get them to think about old things in a new way, about the long arc of the lives of American cities, about who is American, about changing our national meta-narrative, that grammar school history that portrays the catalytic event of American history as the arrival of a boat full of ill, grumpy Protestants in buckled shoes, blown off course on their way to a more temperate part of the New World, changing that to something new, hoping in my writing and reporting to encourage readers to think about this country as something other than essentially, authentically, solely Protestant, European, and white. Not in a preachy way, but as a way of opening up people to reconsider what got us right here, right now, as a way of getting us ready for what we are in the process of becoming, whether we like it or not. The poet Philip Larkin, known far better for his observations on parental inheritance in This Be the Verse, a poem I can't read in a church hall, says in his poem, Church Going, "Once I am sure there is nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut. Another church, matting, seats, and stone, and little books, sprawlings of flowers, cut for Sunday, brownish now. Some brass and stuff up at the holy end, the small, neat organ, and a tense, musty, unignorable silence brewed God knows how long. A lot of our church buildings spend an unbearably large share of their week just waiting for a Larkin to step inside, ready because there is, as he says, nothing going on." Later on in the poem, Larkin tells us, yes, stop I did. In fact, I often do. And always end up much at a loss like this, wondering what to look for, wondering too, when churches fall completely out of use, what shall we turn them into? If we shall keep a few cathedrals chronically on show, their parchment, plate, and pyx in locked cases, and let the rest rent-free to rain and sheep. Shall we avoid them as unlucky places? You can tell Larkin grew up in pre-war England because he knew what a pyx was, and was familiar enough with the term to use it in a poem. It's hard to imagine hearing the word pyx at your local neighborhood poetry site today. Luck, the unpredictable, tangled fortunes of places, has Episcopalians reckoning with their past, perhaps with a shrug, perhaps with regret for lost opportunities, for not being able to see clearly the future of the country, for being late to the party, as American religion does one of its periodic self-disassemblies and starts to become something else. A lot of my perspective on these questions was shaped by growing up in Brooklyn, New York, a place popularly called the City of Churches or the Borough of Churches, where I was an active, present member of 4 congregations growing up. First, St. Bartholomew's Church in Crown Heights, where I was baptized. Church of the Holy Spirit in Bensonhurst. St. Philip's in Dyker Heights, and St. John's in Fort Hamilton Bay Ridge. From those places that formed me, I moved on in a restless adult journey as a reporter and a believer, to St. Luke's Uxbridge Road in London, St. Paul's Within the Walls in Rome, St. Thomas's in West Hollywood, California, St. James Cathedral in Chicago, and St. Columba's here in Washington. And briefly, Grace in Amherst, Massachusetts, and Christ Church in Philadelphia. From my pew, as an adult born in a big American city in the 20th century, and except for that 1 year living in Amherst, living my whole life in big cities here and abroad, I got to watch close up the splits and tears, the struggles and declines of the church that's been my soul's home all my life. But the life of these individual churches tells you plenty about what's been up the last 70 years. The font where I was baptized in the 1950s stands in a New York City historic landmark church. It's even got its own Wikipedia page. An 1886 Romanesque revival church, also on the National Register of Historic Places. Tiffany stained glass windows, historic organ, built in what was then a wealthy neighborhood, sitting comfortably among row houses and grand detached homes. It was a prominent pulpit in early 20th century Brooklyn. In other words, a place you wouldn't be at all surprised to see an Episcopal church. That neighborhood has undergone repeated, massive demographic change. A neighborhood with a relatively small number of Black or Jewish residents before America's entry into World War II, in 1941, has a large influx of people who had been in displaced person camps at the end of World War II and ended up coming to Brooklyn. And by the year I was born, an estimated 25,000 Black people lived in Crown Heights, a quarter of the neighborhood's population, a massive change from the 1930s and 40s. Then fear and suburbanization, large-scale departures for Long Island and Westchester and northern New Jersey, as was experienced in similar neighborhoods in metro areas in the East and Midwest especially. And by the early 60s, the families which had built and sustained the church were no longer around to maintain it. Will Herberg, in his landmark Protestant Catholic Jew, looked at rapidly suburbanizing post-war America and envisioned a country where class-based homogeneity, removed from the ethnic ghetto of earlier in the century, was going to open up a new chapter in America's religious life as well. In Herberg's view, Catholics would no longer be Polish Catholics and Irish Catholics or Italian Catholics. Once they moved to the suburbs, they would just be American Catholics. Jews now generations removed from their port of entry ghettos, from the Grand Concourse, from Maxwell Street, from the Lower East Side, from South Philly, would be Americanized by the transition as well. Jews would be finding common citizenship and increasingly common cause, in Herberg's view, with America's Protestant majority, dominated by the main line, the churches that set America's religious thermostat, by becoming more like it. It would be generous to say Herberg's view of the coming decades was overtaken by events, but a book written in the 50s really wasn't even valid by the end of the 60s. It was totally wrong. No less a scholar than Martin Marty called Protestant Catholic Jew the most honored discussion of American religion in mid-20th century, while conceding just a breath later that Herberg, quote, failed to anticipate almost every important subsequent turn in American life. My old friend Marty was being gentle, as was his nature. Maybe Herberg couldn't have anticipated, no one could have, that the tumbling domino of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka would be a catalyst for the political reorganization of white evangelicals, whose leaders, goaded by Supreme Court decisions in Bob Jones v. U.S. and Allen v. Wright, once and for all slammed the door to tax deductibility for segregated private schools. And the resulting outrage was to fuse with the Roe v. Wade decision and the development of new computer databases to create a juggernaut in American religious life. Herberg couldn't have anticipated the way the wrenching social change and challenge of the 1960s would bring nonstop earthquakes to what had been a kind of orderly, pre-Copernican universe of Methodists and Lutherans and Episcopalians and Presbyterians, American Baptists and Churches of Christ, to bring them tumbling from being kind of a dreadnought sitting high and perturbable in the water to institutions now checking the lifeboats and frantically working the pumps. No one could have foreseen from the vantage point of the 1950s the way the battles for women's rights and gay rights and the continuation of the civil rights movement, the eruption of the war in Vietnam, were all going to metastasize right in the heart of our churches at the same time that there was frantic spatial reorganization of American life. We were both unburdening ourselves from what we were and moving, loading up the moving trucks and going to new places. That was accompanied by the freedom to untether, to uncouple from the faith traditions that helped shape the identity and self-concept of native-born and immigrant families. Assimilation by the second half of the 20th century eventually brought the creation of tens of millions of spiritual free agents and worked to kind of tee up the 21st century. A lot of Episcopal and other churches were now empty in places like Hartford and New Haven and Bridgeport and Brooklyn. But another thing Will Herberg didn't and couldn't have anticipated was the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, the Hart-Celler Act, signed by Lyndon B. Johnson in New York Harbor at the foot of the Statue of Liberty. American immigration quotas had, since 1924, embedded in them a deep preference for Western European immigrants. Those quotas, as of 1965, were now scrapped, and that act threw open the doors to the rest of the world, bringing a surge in Roman Catholic immigration from the Caribbean, South America, Africa, and the Philippines, brought the first significant populations of Hindus and Sikh believers, and the first large settlement of immigrant Muslims, augmenting the tiny numbers of Ottoman-era Muslim families, and the large native-born Muslim congregations of Black Americans in Detroit, Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. And back in Crown Heights, back in magnificent old St. Bartholomew's, my family was gone. The congregation was now almost entirely Jamaican, Barbadian, Trinidadian, Antiguan. A church of empire, saved by accident, and now an accent, an Anglo-Catholic liturgy, and incidentally, no surprise, a great choir. We had moved to Bensonhurst to look for better schools and, incidentally, to extremely unpromising Episcopal territory, a neighborhood inhabited by Italians and Eastern European Jews. The modest white stucco Church of the Holy Spirit sits on one of southern Brooklyn's main drags, Bay Parkway. Back in the 1960s, in a very high-density neighborhood, it owned a shockingly large piece of land with an old rectory on the side street property line, in the shadow of looming apartment buildings. My neighbors identified closely with their church or shul, St. Finbar's, St. Mary Mother of Jesus, St. Athanasius, Sons of Israel, and just up Bay Parkway from the Church of the Holy Spirit, the enormous Reformed Temple Beth Shalom. When other kids would ask me if I went to church, where I went to church, I'd say, Holy Spirit. They'd ask, where's that? And I'd say, well, it's right on Bay Parkway and 82nd Street. And people would knit their brows and say, there's a church there? As the congregation dwindled, it sold off increasingly valuable pieces of its original footprint until it was crowded on all sides by new buildings. But it remained there on Bay Parkway, became a mission, and is today a largely Mandarin-speaking congregation. 2 services a week, one in English, one in Chinese, and a priest in charge trained in an Anglican seminary in Hong Kong. But long before these changes had taken place, we had already moved on to St. Philip's Dyker Heights, the next closest church to our house, a beautiful little place in the middle of large homes on big plots, a place that doesn't really look like Brooklyn at all. When the congregation was flush, they built a beautiful little church. But St. Philip's struggled, not because Dyker Heights had been changed very much by migration, it hadn't really, but because much of its predictable catchment area was torn down to build the access roads to the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, emptying out a swath of Bay Ridge that was home to a large population from Newfoundland. You know, we don't think of there being Newfoundland neighborhoods or Newfoundland restaurants in Newfoundland neighborhoods or people speaking with a Newfoundland accent, but the Newfoundland neighborhood was torn down to make way for the Verrazano, and that got rid of a bunch of the parish territory of St. Philip's Church. So it was odd to sit in my Sunday school room with 3 or 4 other kids and see framed black and white pictures on the wall of enormous Sunday school outings. The assembled classes marching behind the church's banner on Cathedral Day processions in Long Island. And elsewhere in the parish hall, great big gatherings of men's and women's groups, the Altar Guild, and so on. Inside the 1900 church, beyond the lovely old rood screen, resurrected Jesus confronts Mary Magdalene at the tomb, beautifully reproduced by the Tiffany Studio. Part of the fittings of a church that once had money, now cannot call a rector, and like many others, has an endowment that keeps the lights on. The priest in charge, a wonderful young woman who I once taught Sunday school to. When the small congregation called a new rector in the mid-70s, the church couldn't afford to fix up the rectory for our new priest. So the senior warden, my father, by himself, painted, plastered, and wallpapered the entire rectory, nights after work and on his days off. Eventually, the rectory was sold off. The neighborhood got more expensive, more Italian-American, and also more Arab Christian. And the congregation stayed tiny. By that time, we had moved on to St. John's Fort Hamilton, a thriving, bustling, healthy, diverse congregation right at the edge of the old military base. A church where Robert E. Lee had been a vestryman while stationed at Fort Hamilton, where Stonewall Jackson had been baptized in the font, which was still in service more than a century later. Today, St. John's is shuttered, closed, waiting for a new buyer, merged with a nearby Episcopal congregation. What happened? Bad congregational leadership by both ordained and lay people, malfeasance and criminality, and a location in a part of Brooklyn where it might have required very talented leadership to push back against vast demographic change in order to keep the doors open. The role of circumstance in this story struck me when I was reporting recently in Southwest Missouri, and a professor of religion married to a Methodist minister told me, you know, the Episcopalians didn't even get here until after the Civil War. Lights on moment. The consequences of the decision not to aggressively follow the frontier west, the way some of our mainline cousins did, had an enormous impact on our resulting national profile. In a lot of growing places, the church was simply absent as a player. The challenges of the modern religious landscape for the Episcopal Church land very heavily in some places, and in others, not at all. In contrasting these congregational life cycles, I am talking about Brooklyn after all, East Coast, urban, dense, vastly different trajectories for four congregations linked together by the accidental history of one family's life in one county, in one state in America. Two of those churches are now filled on Sunday morning with people not born in the US and their offspring. One is hanging on for dear life, and one that a casual observer in 1980 might have guessed would be the healthiest today. Full and rockin', dense with outreach and healthy ministries, is now just a part of neighborhood lore and has had all its windows and doors removed. The United Daughters of the Confederacy came and took their historic marker, placed at the base of the tree it planted around the Civil War centennial. Accidents. If the church was still open to contemporary times, we might have had a second thought conversation about the United Daughters of the Confederacy memorial on our church grounds. But the church didn't live long enough to see it. Accidents. As the US military redeployed around our continent-sized country, New York Harbor declined in significance. Fort Hamilton was once a very important place because it was high up, overlooked the bay, and if an invading navy came rolling into New York Harbor, you could shoot cannons down onto the boats and eventually make very glorious big paintings about them. But now, nobody's expecting an enemy army to roll into New York Harbor and then man the guns in Fort Hamilton to shoot them out of the water. But of course, the state has a hefty congressional delegation, and congressional delegations are always interested in saving forts because they bring in money and all that. So Fort Hamilton was given a new, smaller role as the home of the Army Chaplain School. The America that once supplied a steady population of Episcopalian soldiers to a bluff overlooking lower New York Bay was now simply a less Episcopal place and part of a less threatened country. A smaller Fort Hamilton trains chaplains to minister to a radically more diverse uniformed force. 70% of America's service people still define themselves as Christian, and a whopping 0.86% of America's uniformed personnel are Episcopalians. Over the years, some 24 flag officers were members of St. John's, which tells you something about the Episcopal Church. All those generals with their plaques up and down the aisles in the old sanctuary, the place where I was married. Today, the remnants of the congregation are some 2 miles away, an emerged congregation. During the heyday, my mother was on the vestry, and my father, again, was senior warden. I had been a Sunday school teacher there. One of my daughters was baptized there. All 3 Suarez brothers were married there. But I had to continue to Forrest Gump my way through the Episcopal Church. As a Eucharistic minister at St. Luke's in London, a busy church, which is not easy to say about the Church of England. But when you went inside, who did you find? people who were baptized in the Church of South India, and divorced Roman Catholics. I taught Sunday school at St. Paul's Within the Walls in Rome, a little piece of America on the Via Nazionale, built by American worthies, bold-faced type names, a gorgeous collection of Edward Burne-Jones mosaics in the choir and apse, including renderings of donors and American heroes as great personalities of the early church in the mosaics. So when you go up after service is over and look at these gorgeous mosaics, who's up there? J.P. Morgan's father on horseback as an early saint of the church, Ulysses Grant, and Giuseppe Garibaldi. A piece of home away from home for American tourists, and a home church for Americans who work at the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization and the American Embassy, and an outpost from which to talk to the worldwide Catholic Church. And with its charter from the government of the state of New York and the authorization of the US National Church, a self-concept of importance. It's a little place, but St. Paul's thinks it punches way above its weight. As we're a small congregation. Along with the Americans, there was a sizable population of Ugandan refugees that began with the dictatorship of Idi Amin and carried on long after Amin had died in exile in Saudi Arabia. After a short stop in New York, my wife and I were on the road again, this time to West Hollywood, California, where I was a correspondent at CNN's LA bureau. St. Thomas's was the Episcopal church closest to my apartment, so St. Thomas's it was. A small wooden church was replaced by the main sanctuary, bravely begun in 1930. Who starts building a church 6 months after the Wall Street crash? But they were pretty confident about their future. The Great Depression was beginning to bite. The Gothic revival construction continued in authenticity of design with its beautiful hammer-beamed roof until the money ran out, right at the end behind the altar. So there was just a big, blank, unornamented concrete wall. Odd. Decades later, with new donors, an ultra-modern, very 60s stained glass window replaced the blank concrete wall, which made for an odd Gothic church with a big floor-to-ceiling 60s stained glass window. Inside, accidents. There was a small congregation, a kind of mix of the families you find in a church anywhere, and a large dollop of showbiz people. Actors, agents, producers, voiceover artists. A lovely and strange place that the bishop wanted to express a particular welcome to the growing gay population of West Hollywood. When the rector retired and we did a parish self-study, I was on the search committee, and dead last of all the things that people chose as important for the next rector to be concerned about, 52nd place was being an affirming and welcoming church for gay Episcopalians. But the new rector took the bishop's hint amid both the struggle for gay civil rights and the desolation of the AIDS crisis. And St. Thomas's grew and grew. And today is a large, healthy, vital place. Anglo-Catholic, finally finished in the Gothic style. The 1960s stained glass window is gone, and there is a gorgeous finish to the church. And how many churches can say on their website the following? St. Thomas's has been the backdrop of many media enterprises. Our classic Gothic revival architecture is singular in Los Angeles and conveniently located to all major studios. Please call the parish administrator and tell us what your needs. But I had to move on. NBC was calling, and I became a parishioner at St. James Cathedral in Chicago, still with its original bell tower, all that remained after the Great Fire in Chicago. St. James rebuilt, even as the neighborhood around it changed over time, from the home of Chicago's most prominent families, no surprise, to boarding houses and low-end retail. After the northern part of Michigan Avenue was reimagined as the Magnificent Mile, and high-end retail fled north from State Street in a deeply racially divided city. Michigan Avenue became the home of white retail. State Street became the home of black retail. The young bishop, James Montgomery, in the midst of pitched battles over desegregation and resegregation, offered the Episcopal Cathedral as a kind of neutral ground where conflicts could be hashed out. City leaders, activists, business leaders, black church leaders from the south and west side all convened for a meeting at St. James called the Summit, where some of the most contentious issues were hammered out and peace maintained in the city during a terrible era of racial strife. St. James was restored to its original arts and crafts opulence in a multi-million-dollar rehab, now standing in a neighborhood where very few people lived at all. And then, accidents. Now surrounded by a densely built neighborhood of massive high-end apartment buildings and living a different life with a larger and more longitudinally reliable congregation. When the city changed, St. James was ready to change, prepared for a new era of growth it never could have anticipated when the vestry rolled the dice on that very expensive historical restoration, a rehab that won preservation awards and national recognition. Today, in the choir loft, where no less than Leo Sowerby once led the singers, an outstanding ensemble makes the church a cherished home of excellent music which attracts visitors from all over the city. I reluctantly left Chicago in 1993 to come here to Washington and headed to the closest Episcopal church to my front door, St. Columba's, just off Wisconsin Avenue, just a few miles north of here, celebrating 150 years since it was established as a mission of this church, St. Albans, one of a constellation of small wooden chapels carrying the names of British Isles saints: Patrick, Dunstan, David, Columba. Who's missing? The English patron, St. George. There was a St. George's Church. It was just a few hundred yards away from St. Columba's. Why were there two Episcopal churches within a few hundred yards of each other? In the early 19th century, because St. Columba's was white and St. George's was black. It began in a settlement of freed people and runaways heading for the Union Fort at that site to work as laborers and blacksmiths and teamsters. 60 years on from emancipation, Fort Reno, with its separate church, with a school operated by the desegregated DC public school system, was one of very few areas of black residence in that part of the city. When first developers, then the WPA, came to the neighborhood, including Charles Glover, whose name now adorns the hotel where we had our banquet last night. When they came looking for the land for a new high school, a reservoir, a park, and a pumping station, they looked all over upper Northwest DC, and amazing coincidence, they chose to demolish and flatten the black neighborhood. Fort Reno, by sheer coincidence, they used eminent domain and brute force to erase a little black town, including St. George's Church. St. George's was a mission of my home church, St. Columba's. The Depression had hit St. Columba's Church hard. A fine church had been built on land donated by a slaveholding family in the late 19th century. The vestry, by the 1930s, was worried about insolvency. When St. George's was condemned and bought out, because it was a mission, the compensation was paid to the vestry of St. Columba's. The parishioners of St. George's were left to fend for themselves, uncompensated for the loss they had suffered by the church that was supposedly their sustenance and support. The funds from the new landlords of Fort Reno solved St. Columba's financial crisis. By the 1960s, the church was once again unsure of its future. Parish leaders, under the guidance of a visionary rector, mortgaged their homes to raise the funds to build a school next to the church. It was completed and in place for the arrival of a wave of two-career families, a new kind of professional couple that began to fill up the alphabetically ordered streets, and a process that was supercharged when the DC Metro was built just a block away from the church. St. Columba's School was in business, with a line around the block of families dropping off their little kids before both parents headed to jobs downtown. Today, the school is a reliable feeder of new families to the church. Many, if not most, not originally Episcopalian. There are more than 2,000 people on the rolls. Think about that when you think about what's going on in the church nationwide. Their kids are there Monday through Friday, and then again on Sunday for primary choir, children's worship, and Sunday school. And with the unearthing of this problematic history and the relationship with St. George, the congregation is now wrestling with how to repent and repair with this historic debt to St. George's Church. I was talking to my daughter the night before last about a recent trip from her home pulpit at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine on the Upper West Side, where she is a canon, to up Amsterdam Avenue to St. Mary's in Harlem to celebrate Eucharist and preach. The church was founded in 1823 by one of the landowners who laid out the street grid in that part of Manhattan, Jacob Schieffelin. Fast forward 200 years, and it is a bilingual church, transformed by an energetic rector who thought positioning this old Harlem landmark this way was strategic. And she was right. A new immigrant congregation has mingled with the old stalwarts of the church, creating something new for this part of Harlem. There's a soup kitchen, Narcotics Anonymous, free mail pickup for people who are irregularly housed or without housing, a medical and dental clinic on Tuesday, a food pantry, and weekly movie night. A lot of the people who make use of these services aren't Episcopalians or weren't Episcopalians, back in their hometowns, scattered across the Americas, or never even knew an Episcopalian until they came to St. Mary's and got what they needed from St. Mary's. They're introduced to us. They're introduced to our way of being Christian by our mere presence. During the aftermath of white flight and some of the worst days of New York City's financial crisis, I had intelligent, respectable, well-meaning men. And I say men because they were all men. People who were on boards of dioceses and people who were senior wardens at great big millionaire churches say to me some version of, I think we still have a lot to offer, but our churches are in all the wrong places. I had only, because I was younger then. Now, no one said that to me lately, I should say. Really, it's important to say that. But back then, in the 80s, 90s, people would say that to me seriously, and I only had an early glimmering of what was wrong with that statement, common as it was in those eras. They were looking at what massive, wrenching, destructive spatial transformation of the flight to the suburbs and the collapse of urban sustainability was doing to the church. They were looking at it like real estate agents, not like members of cathedral boards and diocesan committees and national church organizations. Churches that were built by one group of people. It's true, we're in many cases now dying slow, lingering deaths with dwindling ASA numbers and perilous finances held up by endowments so that long dead members of the church were in real time staving off the inevitable. Or, looked at another way, money set aside by long ago benefactors who loved their church had somehow kept those doors open long enough for someone to have the wit to figure out what the next phase of history looked like. For too long, perhaps with a flawed ancestral assumption that we would always matter. Come on, be honest with me now, those of you with gray hair. You grew up thinking the Episcopal Church mattered and would always matter. When I was a little boy, the Easter sermon at St. John the Divine, the gist of it was covered as a story in the New York Times religion pages because what the Episcopal Bishop of New York said was news. Does anybody care what Matthew, of course I care. Of course I care what Matthew Hyde said on Easter, but is it in the New York Times? No, it's not. We always thought that we would matter. We believed we mattered and would always matter. And I think that created a kind of weird confidence and laziness about what the future was going to mean. It came from the idea that we were an established church that morphed into being an establishment church. We postponed the hard work of figuring out how to keep up with the rhythms of a rapidly changing country. A country where 1 out of every 7 people in our borders today was born somewhere else on the planet, and millions more are their children. In my book, We Are Home, I devote a whole chapter to America's changing religious landscape. I visit an enormous Hindu temple in suburban Dallas and talk to one of the congregation leaders about how an ancient faith can reroute just yards from zooming suburban Sunbelt traffic. I talk with an Ethiopian deacon about the future as he ponders how his younger church members will see themselves. Over time, will they simply identify as Black Americans or retain some of the distinctiveness that sets them and their ancient faith in this country? Will it continue in this country? He knows fewer and fewer members of his congregation speak the liturgical language of the church. It's a separate language from the home language of their province in Ethiopia. Egyptian Copts, he notes, are much further down this road. Will his younger worshipers simply head to all English Coptic worship elsewhere? Or, like their generational peers, leave church altogether? In Harlem, a Senegal-born teacher, a proud and happy immigrant and U.S. Army vet, worries about the fact that fewer and fewer of the teen boys he works with want to become a hafiz, that is, someone who carries that honorific because they've memorized all 6,326 verses of the Quran. He's struggling to keep the boys who've arrived from Senegal away from the temptations and diversions of modern American life. Good luck. It is an immigrant story as old as America, recast for the 21st century. And finally, Father Halim Shukr, a graduate of Virginia Theological Seminary, he leads an Arabic-speaking Episcopal congregation in Dearborn, Michigan. None of the people filling his pews were baptized Episcopalian. The church home, shared with an English-speaking congregation, belongs to a church founded before Dearborn was even incorporated as a city. The rebuilt church had its cornerstone laid by Mrs. Henry Ford. It's that kind of place. Very much originally a church of the swell people, now living its way into a new life for the 21st century, shaped by modern immigration, shaped by the imperative that now faces us as we look out at the rest of the century. We know that wealthy families have fewer children than less wealthy families. We know that highly educated couples have fewer children than less educated couples. And we know that white families have fewer children in America than other families. And the Episcopal Church is high income, well-educated, and white. The triple whammy for low fertility. So, if you thought that we could stay in business through natural increase, well, that's not happening. I had 3. I did my bit. So a church that's historically aggregated, wealthy, well-educated white families doesn't have the secret recipe for future success in this rapidly changing America. The riddle for us to solve, faced with the downward pressure that's already facing every church, faced with the changes in desire to be congregationally affiliated seen in every religion. This is our challenge. How do we continue to be ourselves, liturgically, spiritually, marrying faith and reason? How do we fight back against the very real pressures of secularization? And at the same time, talk to the new America, which is so far very comfortable with the idea that it can live without us, doesn't need anything we're selling. Do we have to surrender what we value in order to be popular? Can we see the new America and the new Americans as a mission field, but drain missionary zeal of the condescension and paternalism that so heavily marked 18th and 19th century evangelism? I'm here today with you in part because I believe we can. Surrender is to proclaim that demography is destiny. If demography is destiny, we're done. We're cooked. We're not going to make it till 2100. Have fun. But I don't believe that. That idea is the path of becoming what sometimes we are dangerously flirting with, becoming a real estate management company that holds a meeting of the club of nice people once a week. Sit with that. We have to be more than a real estate management company with nice people who are shareholders. You are, look, I'm going to stipulate that a lot of you are very nice people. I'm going to make that assumption. But we got to be more than that. We got to break with the West Indians of Crown Heights. They came here already Anglican. So that was easy. The Mandarin speakers of Bensonhurst, a little less so. The Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, and Central Americans finding their way to St. Mary's in Manhattanville are called by an intentional outreach. And there are Episcopal congregations scattered all over the Northeast that have finally gotten that message. Adapt or die. They believe we still have something to say to America. I believe we still have something to say to America, and you're here because you believe that we still have something to say to America. Accidents. History, with some of our own connivance, has dealt us a strange hand. Many people still think of us as a country club church, a white shoe law firm church, a summer house by the shore kind of church. And in the congregations I visit, sometimes that's still true. But in some places, that idea is laughable. Laughable. Go to the South Bronx, where there are landmark churches built by swells and is now inhabited by some of the poorest people in America who come to us weekly for worship, for sustenance, for solace. We have to shake off our history and still love ourselves for who we are and look at America as it is. Look America really in the face as it is becoming. I think we can do it. I think the alternatives are terrible to contemplate. When my daughter was ordained, I guess, where's the cathedral? Back there. Oh, that way. I'm a little disoriented in this building. The night before, she said to me, in 2050, who's going to be out there? And I said to her, well, I'm probably not going to be out there. Maybe with scientific advances or whatnot. But you will, and that's the job, really, for the next couple of decades, is to make sure somebody's out there. And that answer was good enough for that moment. Now she's living into the reality of what that's like. And I still think there is still going to be somebody out there. And that's why it's really our work to rethink and to reimagine who we are, not what we've been. What we've been is what we've been. The swells who filled those churches with Tiffany windows, they were who they were, but we have a future to build that's not, just burdened by that past. I think we can do it. I hope you think we can do it. Let's go do it.